Yes, have a nice French name, but not the accent, unfortunately. I'm going to be talking a bit about the process for one of the synopses for the amphibians, and whether this has relevance to amphibian conservation in South Africa. So for those of you who weren't at the 4 Million Frog Talks the last few days, this is just a quick overview of where amphibians occur across the globe. It's a cartogram, and so the darker areas and the larger areas obviously emphasize where the greatest diversity is. So definitely in South America, in the equatorial regions, and then in South Africa, we're middle of the range as far as diversity goes, with around 160 species currently known from the country. The percentage of threatened species is indicated on this cartogram, and in South Africa, our statistics basically reflect those globally, with around 30% of our species listed by the IUCN as threatened. These threats are many and varied, and often working together in complex ways to make the whole picture even worse, but by far habitat loss is the number one threat to amphibians, by a factor of 4 of the next one, which is pollution. So the global amphibian synopsis is the 4th in a series, and I think they've done bats and birds and a few other things, and there are plans to do a whole lot more, including not only species but also ecosystems. And the amphibian one was published this year, and based on 107 interventions out of 416 studies that were identified for the conservation and, importantly, of amphibians in the wild. The interventions are grouped according to the IUCN threat categories. There's 14 chapters which address, each one addresses one of those specific threats or interventions. The evidence comes from a total of 18 specialist journals, 30 general conservation journals, keyword searches on the web, and this evidence had to fit 2 criteria. They must be interventions that were actually going to be carried out by conservationists, and the effects of the intervention must be able to be monitored quantitatively. The second phase, so once the synopsis was done, they go through a phase of assessing the synopsis using expert opinion, and it basically brings out a summary of the key messages from the synopsis. So of those initial 107 interventions, 98 were chosen for the assessment, and the assessment looks at 3 different criteria for each intervention. Basically, the effectiveness of the intervention, the certainty of evidence, so in other words, how much literature is the evidence actually based on, and whether there are any negative side effects to the intervention. And a panel of 28 international experts were gathered for this quite onerous process, which uses the Delphi method, basically going through different rounds of scoring the interventions, and then you have a chance to go back and have a look at, as a group, how the panel have assessed the various interventions and whether that actually sways your decision on what you originally said. And that's just a little example of what you'd be presented with, and you would have to position your score along there. And that's just giving it to you a bit more clearly. And then, based on the results, each intervention was assessed by these different categories, beneficial right down to not likely to have any effect. And I did a quick tally on what came out of the amphibian synopsis assessment, basically to see and get a good idea of, well, are any of these interventions actually being perceived as being useful to conservation practice. So luckily, around half of them come out in the green, where they actually are seen to be beneficial in the field. And although there is quite a large percentage where even the experts aren't actually sure whether that intervention has any effectiveness. So would something like this have any relevance to what's happening in South Africa as far as amphibian conservation goes? And for some reason my nice picture has shifted there. So we have pretty good frog diversity in South Africa, but very low human capacity to actually implement conservation or even carry out research. So in total we've got about 25 people working on, as I said, around 160 species. The map indicates the highest diversity per province. So Western Cape has the highest diversity of frogs that are threatened. And there we have around 6 people actively working in conservation. I haven't included students, although obviously they do contribute. But if we're going to look at this sort of as permanent people in the field, I think it's quite difficult to include students that may produce something and then leave. In KZN, there are now about 4 people actively working. Eastern Cape, around 3. And Potchefstroom, where there aren't any actual threatened frog species, there's a really good group contributing to conservation research. Our red list process for amphibians in South Africa is actually really up to date. There was a first assessment done in 2004. This was followed up in 2010, and the follow-up of that is planned for next year. So as far as things go globally, we're actually really up to date in South Africa with our red list process. However, amphibian conservation practically is still very much in its infancy. There haven't been very many projects that actually test any of these interventions, and as a result, very little has been published on this. So these are the 14 chapters that are covered in the synopsis, and basically the take-home message from this is that really all of them have relevance in a South African context. As I mentioned, the biggest threat to amphibians is habitat loss, and this is definitely true for South Africa as well. Invasive species also covers disease. The disease aspect is not too crucial in South Africa, but something that we need to be cognizant of, but also looking at invasive species like fish or frog species moving beyond their native range. I've also highlighted education and awareness for South Africa. I think it's probably inherent to know that the more we know about something, the more we can get the public to understand something, then the more likely we are to be able to conserve that. But we're also in our infancy with that. As far as how South Africa contributed to the synopsis, there's only 2 references that come out of South Africa. One was on permits, and another one I think was on relocation of Cape plat owners. So as I say, very little actually coming out that can contribute to this kind of study, and broadly very little from Africa as a whole. Most of the references come out of the United States and Western Europe. Myself and my colleague Shay Weldon from Northwest University were selected as part of the expert panel with I think 28 people in total. So that's probably actually quite good representation to have on that panel, so that was great. And of course for South Africa we're only interested in interventions that apply to frogs because that's the only type of amphibian we have in South Africa. I thought I'd just touch on legal protection. In the assessment, basically it comes out as not really having much weight in terms of having effectiveness for conservation of amphibians. And so are we possibly wasting our time in coming up with things like biodiversity management plans and all of that kind of thing? But I think these things are often double-sided, and a lot of what's happening to go into these plans ends up contributing to the overall conservation, whichever way it ends up being implemented. Something that's also been spoken about but hasn't really happened yet in South Africa is a possible translocation of frogs as a result of developments that are going to force the habitat to be lost. And in the synopsis, this does come out as an intervention that is likely to be beneficial for frogs. And there's multiple facets to this, so translocate amphibians, but also how do you do that, captive breed them, release, all of that. And so the synopsis covers that in quite good detail and will be quite a nice guide when and if we get to that stage for some of our South African species. Transportation and service corridors. That intervention dealt with threats that many amphibians around the world are faced with in terms of roadkill and fragmentation of their habitat from transportation corridors, and one that is potentially very applicable to South Africa as well. And I picked out just a few. Installing barrier fencing along roads was found to be 65% effective. The certainty of the evidence was 68%, and relatively low harms, 23%. Whereas using humans to assist migrating amphibians across the road was essentially found to be not that beneficial to frogs. And so that really ties in quite nicely to a project that's been going on for a number of years now, started in around 2006 with the volunteer groups in the Western Cape that literally will move toads off the road and help these frogs move across the road. But if we look at what the evidence tells us, that's actually not really helping to save frogs at the end of the day. And although we didn't use the synopsis, the next stage of this project was installing barrier fencing along Noordhoek Road, which from the results from that we could see was much more effective than just the patrolling. And the next stage for that, they've now received funding from the Table Mountain Fund to actually look into installing permanent structures along the roads, which the synopsis tells us is a good intervention. And raising awareness and education, as I mentioned, something that I think is inherently known to us. It's something that will help, and the synopsis agrees with this, is that anything that we do to raise awareness, campaigns, education, using citizen science, is all likely to be beneficial to amphibian conservation. And in South Africa, we are making some inroads with that. We've recently done a survey that assessed the attitudes of people to frogs, and we had over 2,000 respondents to that, and we're analysing that data to try and get an understanding of what are some of the cultural superstitions and myths around frogs and whether those actually impact our efforts to conserve them. Social media is a growing tool for raising awareness and getting people interacting about frogs, developing various educational materials, and we'll punt for 28th of February, Leap Day for Frogs, which hopefully will be an annual event coming up again next year. And there really is, I mean, I started in 2012 and 2 people rocked up to the one event that I had. Last year we had 30 events and there must have been 500 people across the country attending events. So it's getting there. And nice to know that it's backed up by evidence. None of this, of course, really has any relevance. As I say, in South Africa, very little is published and known about effectiveness of interventions. And so there's now quite a strong move to monitoring and being able to quantify what's happening with the interventions, and various monitoring protocols are being developed and rolled out, particularly in KZN. There are existing ones in the Western Cape already. And this will basically help us collect the baseline data before any interventions are rolled out, and so that we know what's happening thereafter. And what's the bigger picture for all of this? Why are we trying to understand what the conservation interventions do? I think something that's come out of these talks and the talks before is coordination between everyone who's involved and meeting those gaps between research and practitioners. And I mentioned not including the students, because often something is published in a master's thesis and then sits on a shelf. And so how can we start getting that information incorporated into our conservation plans? So I think overall, as hopefully an amphibian conservation practitioner in South Africa, this document is going to be highly useful for guiding decisions, and also to identify gaps in our knowledge. As I say, there is a gap that we are trying to bridge between the research and the conservation areas, and very little has been published in South Africa. Barriers are the usual: lack of capacity, lack of funding, and these perceptions around frogs. But again, all of those things can be helped by having everything condensed in the synopsis. What I found just looking at the interventions is often an overlap between many of them. So you'll have a road mitigation project, but it's being done by citizen science. So there's a lot of overlap between various interventions. And as we've been talking about in terms of publication, are our incentives actually misguided because we're aiming for those high impact journals, and how can we really start focusing our efforts into getting these things to be practically applied? A lot of information also comes out of just assessments, environmental impact assessments, and consultants are doing those for money, but actually they often are finding threatened species or new information about species and habitats that could also contribute to conservation evidence. And I think I've said that 400 times now, so thank you very much. Helen Meredith from University of Kent coordinated the assessment of the synopsis, and Jessica Welsh for her comments, and my co-author who had to leave for Potch, Shay Walden. Thank you.